You watched them chew the salted lizard skin and smiled when they thanked you for it. Welcome back to Brutal History for Sleep, where dinner is suspicious and dessert might be divine punishment. If bedtime treachery helps you drift off, like and subscribe. It keeps the channel alive longer than most ancient cooks. Let me know where you're watching from and what hour your cravings turn slightly criminal. Tonight, you roast gazelle eyeballs, ladle out honeyed locusts, and convince the court that pickled hippo skin is a gift from the gods. Close your eyes. The fire crackles. Your body sinks beneath warm sheets heavy with sleep, or something heavier. The silence stretches, thick as syrup left too long in the sun. You can still feel it on your tongue, the sour tang of something half-rotted and holy. The room drifts away. Now there is only torchlight on stone, the clink of gold bowls, and the thick perfume of lotus and roasted meat. Around you, priests chant and nobles swallow. You serve them figs crawling with ants and call it tradition. No one dares complain, not yet. The Nile had a schedule, and it stuck to it better than any pharaoh's scribe. Every year, like clockwork, the great river would swell, overflow its banks, and turn the entire Egyptian landscape into one massive muddy buffet table. The ancient Egyptians called this season Akhet, the inundation, though a more accurate translation might be that time of year when everything smells like wet donkey and opportunity. Picture it. Millions of acres of farmland suddenly underwater, fish flopping in what used to be your garden, and everyone from peasants to priests wading through knee-deep silt with the kind of determined optimism that only comes from having no other choice. This was harvest season, Egyptian style, where the main crop was whatever didn't drown. The flooding brought fertile soil, they said. Black gold, they called it. What they didn't mention was that it also brought mosquitoes the size of sparrows, water snakes with attitudes, and the occasional confused crocodile who'd taken a wrong turn at Memphis. But the Egyptians were nothing if not resourceful. When life gives you floodwater, you make beer, lots and lots of beer. And oh, what beer it was. Thick as porridge, chunky as bad soup, and strong enough to make you forget that your house was currently doubling as an aquarium. Egyptian beer wasn't so much brewed as it was assembled. Take some barley, let it get good and mouldy, add some dates for that extra hint of what died in here, and ferment it all in a clay jar that had previously held who knows what. The result was a beverage that was part meal, part religious experience, and part biological weapon. Everyone drank it. Babies got beer in their clay bottles, watered down, of course, because the Egyptians weren't complete barbarians. Workers received beer rations instead of wages, which probably explained why the pyramids took so long to build. Even the gods got their daily beer offerings, though one suspects they politely poured it into the Nile when no one was looking. The brewing process was a family affair. Mother would chew the grain to start fermentation. Yes, chew it, because apparently human saliva was the secret ingredient everyone was dying to know about. Father would strain it through a basket that had seen better days, usually around the time of the Old Kingdom. And the children? They got to stir the pot with sticks that doubled as discipline rods. Multi-purpose tools were very big in ancient Egypt. But beer was just the liquid courage needed to face the real staple of Egyptian cuisine, bread. Now, when modern people think of bread, they imagine something soft, fluffy, perhaps with a nice crust. Egyptian bread was more like edible pottery. It came in over 40 varieties, though variety here meant different shapes of the same tooth-breaking experience. The wheat came straight from those flooded fields, which sounds romantic until you realize it meant the grain was usually mixed with a healthy dose of sand, small stones, and the occasional confused beetle. The grinding process, 2 stones rubbing together, only added more grit to the mix. By the time the bread was baked, it had the texture of sandpaper and about as much nutritional value. Baking happened in clay ovens that reached temperatures somewhere between surface of the sun and casual glimpse into the afterlife. These ovens served multiple purposes: bread making, pottery firing, and, on particularly hot days, disposing of evidence. The bread emerged hard enough to use as building material, which wasn't entirely coincidental, given the state of Egyptian dentistry. Speaking of teeth, the average Egyptian lost most of theirs by age 30, and bread was the prime suspect. The sand and grit wore down enamel faster than a pyramid slave's enthusiasm. Skulls from the period show teeth ground down to the nerve, which must have made every meal an adventure in pain management. No wonder beer was so popular. It was probably the only painkiller available. But the bread wasn't just gritty. It was also inhabited. Weevils, beetles, and various other protein supplements made their homes in stored grain. The bakers had two choices: spend hours picking out each individual insect, or embrace the extra nutrition. Guess which option won when you're baking for a workforce of 10,000? The beetles became such a common bread ingredient that they practically qualified as a food group. The sacred scarab beetle, revered as a symbol of rebirth and the morning sun, was significantly less sacred when found half-baked in your morning roll. But the Egyptians, ever philosophical, probably figured that eating the symbol of rebirth would grant them some sort of spiritual recycling program. Children grew up on this diet of liquid bread and solid beer, or was it the other way round? Either way, their first solid food was usually a chunk of bread soaked in beer until it reached the consistency of cement paste. Parents would lovingly mash this concoction and spoon it into Junior's mouth, probably while muttering protective spells against choking and dental damage. The working class had their own bread hierarchy: fresh bread for the overseers, day-old bread for the skilled workers, and whatever was left, usually something with the consistency and flavour of a mud brick, for everyone else. By the time it reached the bottom of the social pyramid, the bread had usually developed its own ecosystem. Still, it was calories, and when you're hauling limestone blocks in the desert heat, you're not exactly picky. Religious festivals meant special bread, temple bread, blessed by priests and offered to the gods before being redistributed to the faithful. This bread was made with pure ingredients, which in ancient Egyptian terms meant they'd only found 3 beetles in the batch instead of the usual dozen. It was whiter, softer, and only broke 2 teeth instead of 4. Luxury. The priests, of course, had their own exclusive bread recipes. These involved imported wheat, filtered water, and ovens that didn't double as crematoriums. They insisted this wasn't favoritism. The gods simply demanded higher quality offerings. The fact that priests ate the offerings after the gods had spiritually consumed them was just a happy coincidence. Markets bustled with bread sellers hawking their wares. Fresh bread, they'd cry, and by fresh they meant baked sometime this week. Special recipe usually meant they'd added an extra handful of sand for texture. The bargaining was fierce. This bread could feed a family of 6, yes, if you used it as a weapon against them. Some entrepreneurial bakers tried to improve their product. They experimented with different grains, added herbs, even tried using milk instead of water. These innovations were met with the kind of suspicion usually reserved for foreign invaders and new tax policies. If bread was good enough to break your grandfather's teeth, it was good enough to break yours. The beer and bread diet had some interesting side effects. Egyptians were shorter than their neighbours, had terrible teeth, and suffered from numerous digestive issues, but they were also remarkably resilient, possibly because anyone who survived childhood on this diet could survive anything. Natural selection, ancient Egyptian style. As the floodwaters receded and the baking season reached its peak, the air filled with the aroma of fresh bread and fermenting beer. It was the smell of civilization, of progress, of thousands of people collectively agreeing that yes, this was food, and yes, they were going to eat it. Because what choice did they have? The children would grow up, lose their teeth, and feed the same bread to their own offspring. The cycle continued, as reliable as the Nile floods, as enduring as the pyramids, and about as comfortable as sleeping on a bed of scarab beetles. But it was their bread, their beer, and their beetles. And in ancient Egypt, that was enough to build an empire on. Even if that empire needed a lot of dental work. While the common folk were busy grinding their teeth into powder on beetle bread, the royal palace operated on an entirely different culinary level. Here, in the kitchens of the God King, food wasn't just sustenance. It was art, politics, and occasionally a form of biological warfare. The Pharaoh's kitchen was less a place of cooking and more a theatrical production where the stakes were your life. Head chefs commanded armies of sous chefs, who commanded legions of prep cooks who terrorized small battalions of pot scrubbers. The hierarchy was stricter than the royal succession and considerably more violent. One overcooked quail could mean a demotion from sauce stirrer to crocodile bait. Royal tastes ran toward the exotic. When you're considered a living god, regular roast goose simply won't do. No, the pharaoh required his goose liver specially prepared, force-fed until the bird's liver swelled to the size of a melon, then fermented in honey for exactly 13 days under the light of the full moon. Or was it the new moon? The chef who got it wrong wasn't around to clarify. The fermentation process involved clay jars sealed with beeswax and prayers, buried in sand that had been blessed by 7 different priests. The result was a paste with the consistency of rancid butter and a smell that could clear a throne room. The pharaoh pronounced it divine, which was royal speak for, if I have to eat this, so does everyone else at court. But goose liver was pedestrian compared to some royal delicacies. Take gazelle eyeballs, for instance. Not just any gazelle. It had to be a young male, caught during the dawn hunt, dispatched with a golden arrow. The eyeballs were carefully extracted, marinated in wine mixed with frankincense, and served on a bed of lotus petals. They were supposed to grant the eater exceptional vision, though given how many pharaohs walked straight into political disasters, one has to question the efficacy. The preparation ritual for gazelle eyeballs was so complex it required its own scroll of instructions. First, the chef had to purify himself with a week of fasting, probably to ensure he was hallucinating enough to think this was a good idea. Then came the extraction, done with special bronze tools that had never touched common meat. The eyeballs were examined by the court physician, the court astronomer, and for some reason the court poet. Only when all 3 agreed they were auspicious could cooking begin. Hippo was another royal favourite, though favourite might be stretching it. Hunting hippos was the ancient Egyptian equivalent of extreme sports, exciting, dangerous, and frequently fatal. But pharaohs loved the prestige, and what Pharaoh killed, Pharaoh ate. The skin was considered the choicest cut, roasted until it reached the texture of leather armour, then drenched in date syrup until it was theoretically chewable. The hippo skin preparation took 3 days. Day 1, beating the skin with wooden mallets to tenderize it, which was like trying to tenderize a sundial. Day 2, marinating in a mixture of beer, vinegar, and the tears of the kitchen staff. Day 3, roasting over a fire so hot it required a special underground pit and servants with very long poles. Palace dinner parties were events that combined the worst aspects of performance art with the dangers of chemical warfare. The pharaoh would recline on his golden couch while parade after parade of dishes arrived. Each had to be presented with the proper ceremony, tasted by the official food taster, a job with remarkably high turnover, and approved by various priests before the pharaoh would deign to nibble. The menu for a royal feast read like the fever dream of a deranged zookeeper. Roasted ibis tongues in pomegranate sauce, crocodile tail stuffed with dates and cinnamon, something called desert surprise, which usually involved whatever small mammal hadn't run fast enough, covered in honey and set on fire for presentation purposes. Presentation was everything. Dishes arrived on golden platters carried by servants who'd practiced their synchronized walking for weeks. One stumble, one drop of sauce on the royal floor, and it was back to the granite quarries for you. The food was arranged in elaborate patterns, birds reconstructed with their feathers, fish swimming in seas of sauce, vegetables carved into hieroglyphics spelling out praise for the pharaoh's digestive prowess. The spice trade made things interesting, or rather, interesting, in the way that a tornado is breezy. Merchants brought cinnamon from lands so distant they might as well have been mythical, charging prices that could fund a minor pyramid. The pharaoh naturally demanded everything be seasoned with these precious spices, leading to combinations that defied both logic and taste buds. There was the infamous cinnamon catfish catastrophe during the reign of a pharaoh who shall remain nameless, mainly because the scribes refused to record it. The royal chef, eager to impress, had coated sacred catfish in enough cinnamon to finance a small war. The result was so violently inedible that the pharaoh reportedly exiled not just the chef, but everyone who'd been in the kitchen that day, their families and their cats. Royal leftovers were a complicated matter. You couldn't just throw out food the God King had breathed on, that would be sacrilege. But you also couldn't give it to commoners, that would dilute the divine essence. The solution was to feed it to the sacred animals, leading to some very confused crocodiles wondering why their usual diet of whatever we catch had been replaced with honeyed locusts and fermented figs. The kitchen staff lived in constant terror, not just of the head chef, who wielded his ladle like a pharaoh's flail, but of the food itself. Royal recipes were state secrets, guarded more carefully than tomb locations. One sous chef allegedly tried to sell the recipe for royal phoenix soup, which contained exactly 0 phoenixes but plenty of pigeons, and was found the next morning mysteriously drowned in a vat of beer. The beer was still served, of course. Waste not, want not. Experimentation was encouraged, to a point. That point usually being when someone died. The chef who invented scorpion surprise, the surprise was that it wasn't devenomed properly, lasted exactly 1 dinner service. His replacement wisely stuck to safer innovations, like adding a 4th type of beetle to the grain stores. The pharaoh's personal tastes could reshape the entire culinary landscape. One queen developed a fondness for pickled owl hearts, causing a kingdom-wide owl shortage and a suspicious increase in pickled pigeon hearts that were, "Definitely owl, your majesty. Absolutely not pigeon. May Ra strike me down if I lie." Ra, apparently, was busy that decade. Seasonal menus followed religious calendars rather than agricultural ones. During the Festival of Thoth, everything had to be blue, achieved with questionable dyes that turned everyone's tongue black for weeks. The Feast of Isis demanded white foods, leading to some creative interpretation of what counted as white in torchlit dining halls. Foreign dignitaries were treated to the full Egyptian culinary experience, whether they wanted it or not. Babylonian ambassadors smiled politely through 17 courses of increasingly disturbing protein sources. Nubian princes learned to identify, "That's probably jackal," versus, "That's definitely jackal." Everyone agreed the beer helped. The beer always helped. The royal tasters had perhaps the worst job in the kingdom. Sure, they got to eat food fit for a god king, but they also got to die from it first if anything was amiss. The smart ones developed iron stomachs and faster metabolisms. The lucky ones retired with most of their organs intact. The unlucky ones, well, there was always a need for more royal tasters. Kitchen accidents were interpreted as divine omens. A pot boiling over meant the gods were angry. A perfectly risen bread meant blessings were coming. A chef accidentally dropping the pharaoh's dinner meant that chef was about to have a very short career change to pyramid decoration. The kitchen priests, yes, they had kitchen priests, spent most of their time performing protective rituals and explaining why that burnt smell was actually a good sign. As dinner service reached its climax, with jugglers tossing flaming meat skewers and musicians playing to cover the screams from the kitchen, the pharaoh would sample each dish with the expression of someone who'd forgotten what real food tasted like. Each bite was a political statement, each compliment a promotion, each frown a potential execution. The evening would end with the presentation of the final course, usually something so elaborate it required its own team of engineers. A cake shaped like the Sphinx that breathed actual fire, a honey sculpture of the pharaoh that melted dramatically to symbolize something. No one was quite sure, but it looked impressive and only gave mild food poisoning, so it was considered a success. And in the kitchens, as the last golden platter was scraped clean and the survivors counted their fingers, planning would begin for tomorrow's meals, because in the pharaoh's palace there was always another meal, another impossible demand, another chance to prove that, yes, you could make crocodile taste like chicken if you used enough cinnamon and fear. The gods must be crazy, or at least their earthly representatives certainly ate like it. Death in ancient Egypt was less an ending and more of a career change. You went from person who eats food to person who needs food offerings for all eternity, which, when you think about it, wasn't much of a change at all. The only real difference was that you couldn't complain about the menu anymore. Religious festivals in Egypt were essentially massive catering events, where the guest of honor was either invisibly divine or visibly deceased. The logistics alone would make a modern event planner weep into their clipboard. Feed 10,000 living people? Challenge accepted. Also feed 500 mummies and 17 manifestations of Ra? Now you're just showing off. The Festival of the Valley, one of the year's biggest events, was when families visited their dead relatives' tombs for a nice picnic. And by nice picnic, we mean hauling massive amounts of food into the desert, setting it up in a tomb that smelled like natron and broken dreams, and pretending Great Aunt Nefertiti's mummy was really enjoying that bowl of dates you'd placed before her wrapped feet. The menu for the dead was surprisingly extensive. Honey cakes shaped like hieroglyphs that spelled out cheerful messages like, May you not be eaten by the devourer of souls. Whole roasted ducks, arranged as if they might suddenly spring back to life and fly away, which, given the state of Egyptian embalming, would have been less surprising than you'd think. Jars of beer, because apparently the afterlife was just as difficult to face sober as regular life. The preparation of funeral foods followed strict rules. Everything had to be purified, blessed, and occasionally threatened into compliance. Priests would wave incense over the offerings, while chanting spells that essentially boiled down to, "Please don't let this food go bad in the spiritual realm, because we really can't handle another complaint from the afterlife department." But here's where things got interesting. The ancient Egyptians believed in sympathetic magic, the idea that like affects like. So when texts mentioned the dead consuming the essence of the gods and priests performing rituals where they partook of the divine flesh, well, let's just say some historians got very excited and jumped to some rather dramatic conclusions. The rumours started with mistranslated texts. One papyrus mentioned priests eating the god, which sounds alarming until you realise it was referring to bread shaped like Osiris. Another spoke of consuming divine flesh and blood, which was actually grain cakes and wine, but why let accuracy get in the way of a good scandal? The confusion wasn't helped by the Egyptian habit of being frustratingly metaphorical about everything. When they said the pharaoh devoured his enemies, they usually meant politically. Usually. When texts described the dead king feeding on the gods in the afterlife, it was spiritual nourishment. Probably. The Egyptians loved their ambiguity almost as much as they loved their beer. Some festivals did get rather intense. During the Mysteries of Osiris, priests reenacted the god's death and resurrection with props that included a lot of red wine and suspiciously realistic body parts made from bread dough. Participants would ceremonially eat Osiris to gain his power, which was really just consuming blessed bread and trying not to think too hard about the symbolism. The real feast happened after the gods had their fill. In theory, the divine essence would consume the spiritual essence of the food, leaving the physical matter behind for the priests and faithful. This convenient theology meant nothing went to waste, though it did lead to some awkward questions about what exactly you were eating when you consumed post-offering food. Was it spiritually empty calories, divine leftovers? No one wanted to think too hard about it. Temple kitchens during festival season were barely controlled chaos. Imagine trying to cook for thousands of people, hundreds of statues, and an uncounted number of spirits, all with different dietary requirements. The gods wanted their meat burned just so. The dead preferred their bread softer than what they'd gotten in life. Standards were lower when you didn't have teeth anymore. The living just wanted something that wouldn't give them immediate food poisoning. The offerings themselves told stories. Rich families brought elaborate spreads, entire roasted oxen, towers of honey cakes, enough beer to float a royal barge. Poor families brought what they could. A handful of dates, a small loaf of bread, maybe a clay pot of beer that was mostly water. The priests assured everyone the gods valued intention over portion size, though you'd notice the wealthy dead seemed to have much nicer tomb paintings. Grave goods inventories read like ancient shopping lists. 17 jars of beer, quality dubious, 23 loaves of bread, only slightly mouldy, 1 roasted goose, may contain beetles, assorted vegetables, identification pending. The idea was to provide everything the deceased might need for their journey through the afterlife, including snacks for bribing hostile spirits and offerings for divine gatekeepers with a taste for fermented fish paste. Some tombs were stocked like doomsday bunkers, whole grain stores, sealed jars of everything from honey to pickled onions, even instruction scrolls on how to prepare meals in the afterlife. Presumably the cooking facilities were better there. One particularly anxious noble included clay models of servants whose sole purpose was to cook for him in eternity. Whether they appreciated this honour was not recorded. The mystery cults had their own special meals. Initiates into the mysteries of Isis fasted for days, then broke their fast with foods that supposedly granted visions. Given that the foods included fermented barley water, bitter herbs, and mushrooms of questionable origin, visions were pretty much guaranteed. Whether they were divine visions or just good old-fashioned hallucinations was a matter of faith. Security around temple food stores was tight, and for good reason. Holy offerings had a habit of mysteriously disappearing, especially the good stuff like imported wine and honey cakes that didn't taste like sand. Guards were posted, curses were inscribed, and still, somehow, the morning inventory always came up short. The priests blamed tomb robbers. The tomb robbers blamed spirits. The spirits, wisely, blamed no one and kept eating. The really dedicated faithful would attempt to share meals with the dead. This involved setting two places, putting food on both plates, and having a one-sided conversation with an empty chair. Or a mummy, if you were feeling particularly social. These meals followed strict etiquette. You always served the dead first, never reached across their plate, and absolutely did not comment on their table manners or lack thereof. Children were taught early about feeding the dead. Little ones would toddle up to household shrines with offerings of whatever they hadn't eaten at dinner, which usually meant the vegetables. The dead ancestors were reportedly very fond of onions and leeks, at least according to parents who needed their kids to eat more vegetables. Festival leftovers were redistributed according to a complex system that would make a bureaucrat weep with joy. First pick went to the high priests, who coincidentally always found that the gods had spiritually consumed only the finest cuts. Second tier went to regular priests, third to temple workers, and so on down the line until you reached the temple cats, who at least got fresh mice, attracted by all the grain storage. The biggest festivals could go on for days, each with its own menu and meaning. Day one might be fasting and purification, aka we're saving the good stuff for later. Day two brought out the bread sculptures and artistic food arrangements. By day three, when the beer had been flowing freely and the priests were getting creative with leftovers, things could get a bit freestyle. One recorded incident involved a drunk priest accidentally performing the ritual of feeding the divine crocodile with the last of the honey cakes meant for Sobek. The divine crocodile, being an actual crocodile, showed its appreciation by nearly removing the priest's arm. This was interpreted as a sign of the god's pleasure, because in ancient Egypt, everything was a sign of something, especially when it involved not admitting you'd made a mistake. As the festival wound down and the last offerings were distributed, families would pack up their picnic supplies and bid farewell to their deceased relatives. The tombs would return to their quiet state, watched over by paintings of eternal feasts and the occasional real mouse looking for crumbs. The cycle would begin again next year, with new offerings, new prayers, and the same old hope that maybe this time Great Aunt Nefertiti would actually enjoy those dates. Because in ancient Egypt, death was no excuse for missing dinner. If the pharaoh's kitchen was culinary heaven, then the workers' cafeteria at Deir el-Medina was somewhere around the third circle of gastronomic hell. This was where the artists and craftsmen who decorated the royal tombs took their meals. And by meals we mean nutritional punishment for unspecified crimes against the gods. The day started with porridge. Not the hearty, warming kind your grandmother might make, but a grey, lumpy substance that looked like mortar and tasted like defeat. The grain was whatever was left after the good stuff went to make bread and beer, usually a mixture of barley sweepings, questionable wheat, and whatever small creatures hadn't scurried away fast enough when the storage jars were opened. Cooking this porridge was an art form in itself. First you needed water, which in the middle of the desert was already asking a lot. The water that made it to Deir el-Medina had usually travelled for days in goatskin bags, picking up flavours of leather, sweat, and existential despair along the way. This was boiled in communal pots that had seen better dynasties, stirred with wooden spoons that doubled as measuring sticks and discipline tools. The consistency aimed for was somewhere between wet cement and digestible, though they usually missed on the digestible side. Seasoning was whatever you could scrounge. If you were lucky, a handful of salt. If you were very lucky, some dried herbs that might have been coriander or might have been desert weeds. No one could tell the difference anymore. But the porridge was a feast compared to what came with it. Onions. Mountains of onions, boiled onions, raw onions, onions that had been left in the sun until they achieved a consistency somewhere between leather and regret. The workers ate so many onions that their sweat could clear a tomb faster than any incense. Temple priests banned workers from entering sacred spaces for hours after mealtime, claiming the onion aura offended the gods. The workers suspected it just offended the priests' delicate noses. For protein, there was fish, in theory. The fish that reached the desert work camps had usually been caught weeks ago, preserved in salt that was more sand than sodium, and transported in the same carts used for hauling limestone. By the time it arrived, it had evolved into a new life form, one that moved on its own and smelled like a curse made manifest. The fish preparation process was less cooking and more negotiation with death. First, you soaked it in precious water to remove enough salt to prevent immediate kidney failure. Then you boiled it until it stopped moving, which sometimes took longer than you'd expect. Finally, you ate it quickly while trying not to think about what that crunch might have been. Bones, scales, the hopes and dreams of better meals, all were possible. But at least the workers got meals. Prisoners and criminals, well, they discovered new depths of culinary horror. The standard prisoner fare was something cheerfully called gruel, though cruel would have been more accurate. This was made from grain that even the Beetles had rejected, mixed with water that looked suspiciously like it had been recycled from other purposes, and served at a temperature that suggested no one had bothered with actual cooking. The lucky prisoners got this gruel twice a day. The unlucky ones got sewer stew, a name that was depressingly literal. This was whatever liquid runoff could be collected from the kitchens, boiled, hopefully, and thickened with sand, definitely. Nutritional value was theoretical. Survival value was questionable. The taste was unforgettable, in the way that traumatic experiences tend to be. Down in the quarries, the pit workers had developed their own cuisine, born from desperation and a flexible definition of edible. The base ingredient was usually whatever didn't run away fast enough, which included lizards, snakes, and the occasional beetle, large enough to provide actual sustenance. These were roasted over fires made from dried dung, because wood was for important people, giving everything a distinctive flavour that workers described as earthy. Others used different words. The innovation born from starvation was impressive. Someone discovered that if you left grain in water long enough, it fermented into something that was almost, but not quite, entirely unlike beer. Someone else found that certain desert plants, while toxic when fresh, became merely unpleasant when dried and ground into the porridge. These discoveries were passed down through generations of workers like treasured family recipes, if your family hated you and wanted you to suffer. Sand spice became a running joke. That wasn't actually a joke. Drop your food in the sand? Congratulations, it's now seasoned. The extra texture was described as adding interest to otherwise monotonous meals. The fact that it also added wear to already damaged teeth was considered character building. The pharaohs claimed it taught humility and appreciation for the finer things. The workers claimed the pharaohs could eat sand and see how humble they felt. Water was rationed more carefully than gold. Each worker got their allotment, and woe betide anyone caught taking extra. The punishment for water theft was reduction in food rations, which created a horrible calculus. Die of thirst now, or starve later. The mathematics of misery were well known in the workers' quarters. Sometimes, very rarely, there would be meat. Usually this meant something had died of natural causes, where natural causes included heat stroke, dehydration, or being too slow to escape the cooking pot. The meat was divided according to strict hierarchy. Overseers got the parts that were identifiably meat, skilled workers got the organs, and everyone else got the bits that required imagination to consider edible. The preparation of this meat was a community event, not by choice, but because the smell attracted everyone within a considerable radius. The cooking method was burn it until it stopped looking like it might come back to life. Seasoning was smoke, hope, and occasionally tears. The result was divided into portions so small they could be measured in bites, singular. Vegetables were a theoretical concept. Sometimes withered leaves that might have once been lettuce would appear. These were so precious they were divided leaf by leaf, each worker clutching their single piece of greenery like a talisman against scurvy. Root vegetables that had mummified in the desert heat were reconstituted in water and called soup, though both terms were being generous. The midday meal in the construction sites was often interrupted by sandstorms, adding an extra layer of grit to already gritty food. Workers learned to eat quickly, hunched over their bowls, creating human shields against the desert's attempts to season their meal with yet more sand. The lucky ones had cloths to cover their food. The rest just accepted that sand was now a food group. There were legends of workers who'd tried to improve their lot. One enterprising soul allegedly tried to domesticate the desert rats for a sustainable meat source. The rats had other ideas and staged what could only be described as a rodent revolution. Another group attempted to grow vegetables in the shade of the construction sites, only to discover that limestone dust was not, in fact, a fertilizer. The prison rebellion of year 29 of Ramesses III started not over treatment or work conditions, but when the gruel ran out and was replaced with something even worse: nothing. The prisoners rioted with the energy of people who had literally nothing left to lose, including body weight. The rebellion was crushed, but not before the authorities realized that even prisoners needed some form of sustenance to maintain their value as labor. One prisoner's escape attempt became legendary not for its daring but for its motivation. He didn't run for freedom or family, he ran for a turnip. A single, withered turnip growing wild in the desert. He was caught, naturally, and as punishment was forced to eat the turnip raw while the guards watched. His reported response? Still better than the gruel. They flogged him for insolence, but you could tell their hearts weren't in it. The ingenuity born from desperate hunger was remarkable. Workers discovered that certain stones, when heated and dropped into water, would release minerals that almost resembled flavor. They found that if you chewed leather long enough, it became chewed leather, but at least your jaw got exercise. They learnt that hallucinations from hunger could make the porridge look almost appetizing, though this was considered cheating. The medical complaints from the workers' village were remarkably consistent: malnutrition, dental damage, and what physicians carefully recorded as digestive distress of a profound nature. Remedies included eating more sand for digestive problems, eating less sand for dental problems. As the sun set over another day of tomb construction, workers would gather for their evening meal, porridge again, but this time with the exotic addition of oil that might have been edible at some point in its existence. They'd share stories of meals they'd had in better times, or meals they'd imagined having, or meals that existed only in the perfect world of the afterlife they were busily decorating for their betters. The irony wasn't lost on them. Here they were, painting elaborate feast scenes on tomb walls, depicting tables groaning under the weight of every delicacy imaginable, while their own stomachs groaned under the weight of nothing much at all. They painted roasted geese while eating boiled lizard. They carved hieroglyphs for abundance while experiencing its opposite. But somehow they persevered. Maybe it was the stubborn human refusal to give up. Maybe it was the knowledge that someone had to build these monuments to eternity. Or maybe it was just the hope that tomorrow's porridge might be slightly less awful than today's. It usually wasn't. But in the workers' quarters of ancient Egypt, hope was the only seasoning that never ran out. Temple life in ancient Egypt operated on a simple principle. The gods ate first, the priests ate second, and everyone else got whatever was left. This system worked beautifully for the gods, who, being divine, survived on the spiritual essence of food, and somewhat less beautifully for everyone else, who, being mortal, needed actual nutrients. Every morning, as Ra began his journey across the sky, temple kitchens burst into activity. The daily offerings had to be perfect. The gods were notoriously picky eaters, despite never actually consuming anything. Bread had to be baked just so, beer brewed to exact specifications, and meat roasted until it achieved that perfect balance between pleasing aroma for the divine and still technically edible for humans later. The ritual of offering was elaborate beyond reason. First, the food was purified with sacred water, which was regular water that had been blessed, prayed over, and marked up 500% in price. Then it was presented to the god's statue, with ceremonies that could last hours. Priests would chant, wave incense, and assure the deity that this was definitely the best bread in all of Egypt. Not at all like yesterday's bread, which was also the best bread in all of Egypt. The gods would then consume their meal through a process that looked suspiciously like the food sitting there getting cold, while priests performed interpretive dance around it. The divine appetite was satisfied when the head priest declared it so, usually around the time his own stomach started rumbling, audibly enough to disrupt the chanting. Then came the redistribution, a process with more rules than a pyramid's construction manual. High priests got first choice, naturally. They'd carefully select the choicest cuts of meat, the freshest bread, the beer that hadn't developed suspicious foam. This was, they explained, because their refined palates could better appreciate what the gods had left behind. The fact that the gods had left behind everything was politely not mentioned. Middle-ranching priests got the second tier. Decent bread, acceptable beer, meat that was only slightly charred from the offering fires. They'd learned to time their prayers to finish just as the good stuff was being distributed, a skill passed down through generations of strategically hungry clergy. Lower priests and temple workers got what remained, which was usually bread hard enough to use as building material and beer that had developed its own ecosystem. They supplemented this with a carefully honed sense of religious devotion and the knowledge that at least they weren't eating prison gruel. But the real excitement came during festival redistributions. These were massive affairs, where temple leftovers were shared with the common people, creating a feeding frenzy that combined religious ecstasy with the very practical desire for free food. Lines would form before dawn, winding through the temple districts like extremely hungry snakes. The quality of festival leftovers was variable. That goose that had been sitting in the offering chamber for 6 hours in the desert heat? Still technically goose. The honey cakes that had attracted every insect in a 5-mile radius? Extra protein. The date wine that had been blessed by a dozen sweaty scribes who'd each taken a ceremonial sip? Best not to think about it too hard. People swore the divine leftovers tasted better than regular food. Whether this was due to actual divine blessing or the fact that free food always tastes better was a theological debate that raged in beer halls across Egypt. The cynics pointed out that hunger was the best seasoning. The faithful countered that the god's breath added flavor. The practical just ate and didn't ask questions. Some temples developed reputations for their leftovers. The Temple of Hathor was known for exceptional beer remnants, probably because Hathor, being the goddess of celebration, received better quality alcohol to begin with. The Temple of Sobek, dedicated to the crocodile god, was less popular. Something about the meat offerings there always tasted suspiciously reptilian. The redistribution process wasn't without its scandals. Priests were occasionally caught redirecting the best offerings to their personal stores, claiming the gods had specifically requested that particular haunch of beef be saved for later divine consumption. The gods, conveniently, never contradicted these claims. There was the infamous fig incident during the Feast of Hathor in the 15th year of some pharaoh whose name was struck from the records. A batch of sacred figs had gone bad. Not just bad, but developing their own civilization, bad. Instead of disposing of them, enterprising temple staff redistributed them anyway. The resulting food poisoning was so widespread and violent that 4 temples burned down in the ensuing riot. The official explanation was divine displeasure. The unofficial explanation involved a lot of finger-pointing and several priests taking extended pilgrimages to very distant nomes. Ever since, figs at the Feast of Hathor were examined with the kind of scrutiny usually reserved for royal succession claims. Quality control was, to put it mildly, inconsistent. Some temples maintained strict standards, with dedicated tasters who sampled offerings before redistribution. Others operated on the principle that if it didn't move on its own, it was probably safe to eat. The latter temples tended to have shorter lines but higher mortality rates. The Temple of Ptah tried to innovate with branded leftovers, offerings that came with little clay tokens guaranteeing their divine provenance. This led to a thriving market in counterfeit tokens and some very confused theological discussions about whether fake blessed food. Children were often sent to collect the family's share of divine leftovers, on the theory that the priests would be more generous to small, hungry faces. This led to gangs of professional temple children who weren't actually related to anyone but had perfected the art of looking pathetic enough to score extra bread. The really clever families figured out the timing. They knew that the Temple of Isis redistributed their offerings at the 3rd hour, while the Temple of Horus waited until the 4th. With careful planning and fast feet, one could hit multiple temples in a single morning, accumulating enough divine leftovers to actually constitute a meal. Storage of these blessed remnants was another issue. You couldn't just throw divine leftovers in with your regular stores. That would be sacrilegious. But you also couldn't eat them all at once. That would be gluttonous. The solution was usually a special shelf, pot, or corner of the house designated for god food, which everyone pretended was different from regular food until hunger made such distinctions irrelevant. Some entrepreneurial souls tried to resell temple leftovers, creating a secondary market in pre-blessed sustenance. This was frowned upon by both priests, who weren't getting their cut, and gods, who were presumably upset about the commercialization of their spiritual essence. The practice continued anyway, because hunger and profit were powerful motivators. The theological implications of eating divine leftovers were debated endlessly. Did consuming food the gods had breathed upon grant special powers? Some claimed enhanced wisdom, others reported improved digestion, and at least one man insisted he could now understand what cats were saying. The priests wisely declined to make any official rulings on these claims. Medical texts from the period note an interesting phenomenon. People who regularly consumed temple leftovers seemed to have stronger constitutions. Whether this was due to divine blessing or simply building immunity to questionable food safety practices was left to interpretation. The seasons affected the quality of redistributed offerings. Summer leftovers were a game of chance. Would the meat still be recognizable by the time it reached you? Winter was better, nature's refrigeration keeping things fresher longer. Spring brought the added excitement of wondering whether those green spots were herbs or something that had evolved its own ecosystem. As the day's redistribution ended and the temple gates closed, families would carry home their divine bounty. Children would be warned not to eat it all at once, advice universally ignored. Adults would carefully portion it out to last until the next festival, and everyone would agree that, yes, it definitely tasted blessed. The gods, watching from their celestial realm, were presumably pleased that their worshippers were so dedicated to ensuring nothing went to waste. Or perhaps they were laughing at the elaborate lengths humans went to justify eating leftovers. Either way, the cycle continued. Offerings made, offerings rejected by incorporeal deities, offerings redistributed to corporeal devotees. It was economical, ecological, and theological all at once. A perfect system, as long as you didn't think too hard about what that taste might be. Divine flavor, the priests assured everyone. Definitely divine flavor. The shadow of the Great Pyramid construction site stretched across the desert, like a giant sundial marking mealtimes nobody wanted to acknowledge. Here, in the dusty chaos of humanity's most ambitious building project, the concept of lunch had been reduced to its most basic form, whatever kept you vertical until sunset. Morning at the pyramid sites started before Ra had even considered his daily journey. Workers stumbled from their barracks clutching the breakfast of champions, stale bread that doubled as a defensive weapon, and water that had been filtered through approximately nothing. The lucky ones had saved some beer from the night before, warm and flat but still preferable to facing limestone blocks completely sober. The food distribution system at the pyramids operated with all the efficiency of a government project, which is to say it barely operated at all. Rations were supposedly distributed based on job importance, but by the time they filtered down through overseers, sub-overseers, and sub-sub-overseers, the average block hauler was left with portions that required imagination to consider adequate. The midday meal was announced not by bells or horns, but by the mass collapse of workers seeking whatever shade a half-built monument could provide. Out came the lunch pouches, leather bags that had seen better kingdoms, containing the day's sustenance. The standard meal was salted fish that had achieved a level of preservation somewhere between mummified and fossilized, accompanied by onions that could make a statue weep. For protein variety there was dried lizard, not by choice but because fresh lizard had a tendency to become dried lizard in the desert heat whether you planned it or not. The preparation method was simple. Catch lizard, forget about lizard in pouch, discover lizard jerky days later, eat with resignation. Seasoning was provided by the ever-present sand and whatever emotions you were feeling that day, usually regret. The water situation was its own special form of torture. Hauled from the Nile in clay jars that leaked more than they carried, by the time water reached the construction site it had acquired the temperature of molten copper and the taste of whatever had died in it during transport. Workers learned to drink quickly, before their brains could process what their tongues were reporting. Elite workers, the skilled artisans who carved hieroglyphs and fitted the precisely cut stones, received special rations, special being a relative term, that meant their bread had fewer weevils and their beer was only mostly water. They also got dates, though calling them fresh required the kind of optimism usually reserved for afterlife planning. The foremen occupied a middle ground in the food hierarchy. They got actual cheese, or what passed for cheese after sitting in the desert heat. Workers had nicknamed it brick cheese, partly for its texture, partly for its structural similarity to building materials. It could survive anything: heat, sand, time itself. Whether it could survive digestion was another matter entirely. One scribe, in a moment of either honesty or heatstroke, described the pyramid workers' lunch as tasting of revenge. When asked to elaborate, he simply gestured at the half-built monument and the endless desert. The meaning was clear. This food was punishment for some cosmic crime nobody could remember committing. Innovation born from desperation was everywhere. Workers discovered that if you buried your water jar in sand during the morning shift, it might be a degree or two cooler by lunch. They learned that crushing dried dates and mixing them with water created a paste that was almost, but not quite, entirely unlike edible food. They found that if you squinted hard enough and had suffered enough heat stroke, the brick cheese almost looked like actual cheese. The accident rate after lunch was noticeably higher than morning shifts. Whether this was due to heat, exhaustion, or the digestive system's rebellion against dried lizard and brick cheese was a matter of some debate. Foremen blamed laziness. Workers blamed the food. The food, wisely, remained silent. Sometimes, very rarely, there would be meat from something larger than a lizard. Usually this meant a donkey had expired from overwork, providing an unexpected protein bonus. The meat would be distributed according to the ancient and sacred tradition of whoever got there first, leading to scenes that combined feeding frenzy with religious experience. The cooking facilities at the pyramid sites were primitive even by ancient Egyptian standards. A few communal fire pits, some bent copper pots that had seen better dynasties, and the collective hope that heat killed whatever was living in your food. Fuel was whatever would burn. Dried dung was popular, giving everything a distinctive terroir that sommelier would struggle to describe politely. Spices were the stuff of dreams and hallucinations. Salt was precious, hoarded like gold and used sparingly. Herbs were whatever grew in the desert, which wasn't much and was usually toxic. The main seasoning was resignation, liberally applied to everything. As the afternoon wore on and the sun reached its peak sadistic intensity, workers would dream of the evening meal. Not because it would be better, it wouldn't, but because it meant the day was almost over. The dreams were specific. Bread that didn't require a hammer to break, water that didn't taste like it had opinions, beer that remembered it was supposed to be beer. The pyramid project managers, in their infinite wisdom, occasionally tried to boost morale with special meals. These usually coincided with visits from royal inspectors, and consisted of the regular food with the addition of something exotic, like a different type of onion. Workers would line up for these feasts with the enthusiasm of people who had forgotten what enthusiasm felt like. Religious ceremonies at the construction site required their own food offerings. The gods overseeing the pyramid building apparently had simpler tastes than their temple-dwelling counterparts. Or perhaps the priests just assumed that gods of manual labor would appreciate workers' food. Either way, offerings of brick cheese and dried lizard were made with straight faces, and presumably accepted with divine bewilderment. The medical tent near the construction site saw a steady stream of digestive complaints. The physician's standard treatment was a potion made from various herbs that tasted worse than the food causing the problems. This was intentional. If the cure was worse than the disease, people would think twice before complaining. As the years of construction dragged on, a sort of culinary folklore developed among the workers. Stories of legendary meals from the early days of construction, when the bread was supposedly soft and the beer actually contained beer. These tales grew with each telling until the first workers were dining on ambrosia while current workers gnawed their brick cheese in envious silence. Children born at the workers' village grew up on pyramid food, developing iron stomachs and low expectations. They played games like Guess the Meat and Is This Edible? They learnt that hunger was the best sauce and that sand was just extra minerals. They were prepared for anything life could throw at them, having survived childhood on construction site cuisine. The completion of each pyramid level was celebrated with a feast. Feast being a generous term for slightly more of the same things, but there might be honey cakes that actually contained honey, or beer that remembered its ancestry. Workers would gather, exhausted and underfed, to celebrate another step toward architectural immortality and their own mortality. As the sun set on another day of pyramid building, casting long shadows across the desert, workers would gather for their final meal. The same bread, the same dried fish, the same resignation seasoned with sand. But there was something else too. The knowledge that they were building something eternal, even if their food was barely temporary. They'd sit in the cooling desert air, sharing stories and complaints, chewing slowly on food that required commitment to swallow. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, more stones, more heat, more brick cheese. But tonight, they had survived another day. The stars would emerge brilliant in the clear desert sky. Workers would lean back, bellies not quite full but no longer actively angry, and perhaps think about the eventual occupant of this massive tomb they were building. Would the pharaoh appreciate their sacrifice? Would he know about the brick cheese and dried lizard that fueled his eternal monument? Probably not. But that was okay. The workers had each other, their shared suffering, and the knowledge that tomorrow's bread couldn't possibly be worse than today's. It usually was, but hope springs eternal, even in the desert. And so they drift off to sleep, dreaming of softer bread and cleaner water, of beer that wasn't mostly memory, and cheese that didn't require a chisel. Dreams of the afterlife, where surely the food would be better. After all, it couldn't be worse. Sleep well, ancient builders, sleep well. Thank you for listening, one last time. May your sleep be deep, your dreams quiet, and your mind at peace. Good night.